Hey guys, Kevin here with etrailer, and today I'm going to be showing you how to install the Progressive Dynamics Pure Sine Wave inverter with transfer switch on our 2007 Four Winds Chateau Class C motorhome. Progressive Dynamics Pure Sine Wave inverter with transfer switch is going to come in three different wattages. There's the 1000 watt, which I'm holding right here, an 1800 watt, and a 2000 watt. So you'll need to determine how much stuff you're going to try and power off of your inverter and off of your battery. The 1000 watt comes with either the included 15 amp cord or just with a hardwire version, which we actually installed today. The difference with this is it's more for like OEM. If like the manufacturer of the RV was installing one of these already, they could run a dedicated line to an outlet instead of having to hardwire it. That's really up to you if you want to use it that way or if you just want to hardwire it. It really isn't that much harder to do. So the two main types of inverters that we carry are modified sine wave or pure sine wave. With the inverters that we are talking about today, these are pure sine wave. So these are going to be good for any sensitive electronics, so like our outlets, charging any phones, tablets, any kind of computer you have, or your TVs. Whereas if you have a modified sine wave, that's really only good if you're going to be powering things that generate heat, like your fridge or your microwave or power tools, stuff like that, where it's not as sensitive and you don't have to worry about it overheating. While we don't recommend using modified sine wave for your sensitive electronics, you still can. It will just generate more heat and you can run the risk of damaging your equipment. So our neighbor's main concern when inquiring about an inverter was that they wanted their kids to be able to watch TV, charge their tablets, play on their phones, whatever, while he was driving to wherever they needed to go. So with our inverter installed, as you can see, I have our shore power plug in my hands. We are not hooked up to any kind of power pedestal, but yet we still have our TV running and all of our outlets are now working as well, which I can show here with my phone charger. As you can see, it's now charging. So we've solved our neighbor's issue with having no power to his outlets and to his TV, which is now going to help entertain his kids while he's making long hauls to whatever campground they want to go to. So what you can expect from this installation, it is somewhat tedious. There is a lot of running wire, especially depending on your space. If you have larger cargo bay space and easier access to your battery and your converter, it's going to be a pretty easy install. For us, it was a little bit harder just because I was having to run from one end of the motorhome over to the other end and kind of trying to work my way through the frame so that I could secure all my wiring without having it be near any moving parts or anything that's going to be generating any heat. Other than that, you're just going to need to ensure that you have a converter panel that has 2 bars or have a extra AC distribution panel that you can connect to, just like we did with our little sub panel. That way you can make sure that the transfer switch works. Other than that, not too bad of an install. Like I said, if you have extra space, easy access to your stuff, it'll be really easy for you. So the first step for our installation here is to find exactly where we're going to mount our inverter. So it has to be within 10 feet of your battery, but it also has to be in its own cargo space away from everything else. It needs to be able to breathe, so it has to be in a well-ventilated area with 0 moisture and plenty of room to itself so it doesn't cause any kind of issues. So the closest space that we had, because we've looked around a little bit and just couldn't really get anything that we really wanted, is just the second cargo bay right over here. As you can see, there's no vents or anything in here, so I am going to have to cut out a vent. We determined that the back wall is probably going to be the best spot for our vent because we don't want any chance of any water or anything else kicking up off of the road and coming through either of the sides here and then getting our inverter wet. So what I'm going to do is mount my inverter on this sidewall right here. And another thing that you need to keep in mind is that you're going to need 2 inches of space above and below for proper ventilation. I've already gone ahead and measured, and we have just a little over 2 inches both top and below, so we're going to be good to go ahead and mount our inverter here. So the next step of our installation is going to be finding out exactly how we're going to hook it into our distribution panel. Our neighbor today has a converter and distribution panel in one, but it's only a 30 amp service with only one bar. To do this, you're going to need 2 bars because we're going to have a 20 amp breaker on our main panel here that's going to be our power in with our AC, and then we're going to run that over to a separate panel, which we've done right over here. We just got a little sub panel from our local hardware store. You can do the same, or Progressive Dynamics also has a AC distribution panel that you can also purchase. And we are going to run our power AC in over here and run our AC out from our inverter over to our sub panel so that we can power our AC products with our DC batteries. So the first thing I needed to do was determine which breakers that were powering what items that we were wanting to actually power with our inverter. I determined that both of our twin 15 amp breakers here that we had on our main panel were going to be powering the outlets that our neighbor needed power to, so I had to move those over from our main panel over to our sub panel because this is the only way these are going to receive power from the inverter when we're running off of the inverter power. So now that we have all that determined, I'm going to get under our motorhome and I'm going to find a nice place for me to run my wiring because we have to run our AC in and our AC out from over here all the way to the front of our motorhome where I'm going to be installing the inverter. So let's get under, see if we can find a nice place to drill down through. All right, now that I found where I want to have my wires pass through our floor, I'm going to drill down. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run my wire through because I don't know exactly how much I have to run here distance-wise. So I'm just going to go ahead and start with the whole roll and run it out to my inverter. So I'd rather have plenty out there and then just what I need inside to run to my sub panel. I'm going to start with that because that's going to be my longest distance here. And in the manual, it states that you can use 14 gauge wire up to 100 feet. We have some 12 that we've already been working with, so I'm just going to keep using that. And it's already jacked for outdoor use, so we're just going to make sure this is really heavy duty. We don't want any issues down the road. But I'm going to run this over how much I need to hook into my 20 amp circuit breaker that I'm going to install in here. I actually need just a bit more. And we'll leave it like that and go from there. But now we can go outside and start running our wire from our hole right here along our frame up into our little cavity that we're sticking our inverter in. All right, so now that you can see where our wiring is coming out, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to trace this wire loom because this actually runs all the way up over to the battery. So it's going to be in a nice safe location away from any moving parts or any parts that are going to generate heat. So as we go along and I route it around the frame with this wire loom, I'm just going to take some zip ties and connect it on here so that our wiring is nice and secure. We don't have to worry about it moving around or anything like that or falling down. So I held the inverter up in here and I made my holes. It's a little hard to show on camera, so I'm just telling it to you after the fact, just because it's going to be real hard to kind of mount it in there and also get our camera in. But now the next step is, now that I got this off, I kind of know where I need to put my holes, because on the bottom of our inverter, we're going to have our AC in and we're going to have our DC and our AC out. So we have to run our 2 wires that we went under the through the body, out down the frame, and then up into this cavity here, and then we're going to also have our DC side, which is going to run right over to our battery. So I'm going to need to cut out, I'm going to actually do 3 separate holes. I'm going to do one for my in, one for my out, and then one for my DC. So I'm just going to stay within my bolt pattern for our mounting holes. All right, so to access our wiring, we're going to move this panel right here. You can do that just by moving this screw. And then our screw right here. Be careful you don't lose these. These are super important. And we'll slide this right out. As you can see, we have our AC in, which also has little indicators showing on the inside exactly which wire is going to where. Here we have our power wire, our ground, and then our neutral. Same thing down here. Power wire, ground, and our neutral. Over here we have our wires for our DC running to our battery. We have our positive that's going to run through right here, and that you're just going to need a 5/30 seconds Allen key just to undo that screw there and then retighten it. And then same thing over here with our neutral wire, and then we have a ground right out here that we will just run to our chassis. All right, so now this wire that I have run up from our converter, I'm going to use as my AC in. So I'm going to go ahead and strip back some of the casing. It's a little bit tougher because I used casing that's meant for outdoor use, since it's going to be running out on our frame. All right, so now for the other wire that was going to run to our AC out, that second sub panel that I also ran through our frame, I'm going to strip back the wiring so that we can install this all at the same time, make it real easy, because once we get these wires in place, it's going to be a little tough to kind of move our box around. So I'm also going to mount it up to the wall and then worry about getting the DC side in afterwards. All right, so now that I have my wires stripped back how I need them to be, I need to make sure that I put them in the appropriate hole. For this wire, it's going to be going to my AC in. So I'm going to put it in my first hole here so it matches up once we have our inverter mounted. And then my second one is going to be running to my out. So I'm going to have it in the middle there. And then now we can run it into our panel. So this is a super easy install once we get to this part. Here, I'll pull it back out. Like I said, we have our out, or our hot, we have our ground, and then we have our neutral. So all it is just a little push-in clamp. Get my wiring in here, I can just simply push it in, and once it's in place, you're not going to be able to get it back out unless you stick a flathead screwdriver in there to force the clamp to open. All right, now that I got them all three wires pushed in, I'll give it a little bit more force. I really want to make sure that we don't have any loose connections here. And then we can try yanking on it. As you can see, I can't get it to come back out. So we know we're good. We can go ahead and do our AC in now. All right, now that I have my connections made for our AC in and out, I'm going to go ahead and I am going to bolt our inverter back in place. This is going to require two hands here just because of how this is set up. Normally, if you're putting this in like a bigger cargo bay, like on a fifth wheel or something like that, it's a little bit easier. You don't really have to struggle as much, but since this is our only available spot, I'm gonna need a second pair of hands on the other side to tighten our bolts. So this wire right here is our AC in. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna install it into our main panel. So this is our DC or AC and DC distribution panel along with our converter. Make this in here nice and tight, and we'll tighten up our clamp holding our wire in place. And like I said, you really need to make sure that you're picking the right cable. You don't want to mix these up. So now we are going to run our wire to a 20 amp breaker. This one needs to be all by itself. It is a dedicated breaker just for our inverter. So we'll go ahead and actually I'm gonna get this in place first. I left a little bit extra wiring here just in case I needed it, but I may end up cutting it back depending on the length, which actually I think it might be good. All right, we'll stick our black wire, which is our positive, into our breaker, tighten that down. Make sure it's nice and snug in there. Go a little yank test, all good. Going to wire our neutral wire over to our neutral bar here, which this I actually will cut down just a bit. I don't need that much. I gotta kind of fight some of the other wiring in here. I have that in place. I can tighten our screw. And then we can run our ground up to our ground bar up here, which also I'm going to trim off just a bit. Now that I have that in place, go ahead, tighten our screw. And now we're going to do the same thing on our sub panel that we installed earlier. All right, so now we have our AC out. I've already run it up into my panel, stripped back the casing, and we're going to hook up our black wire to our 20 amp circuit breaker. We'll slap our breaker in place. I just stuck it up top. This is basically like your main for this panel when the inverter's on, so I wanted to have that easily accessible. Then we'll run our ground over here into our ground bar. Which once again, fighting a little bit of wire here. Tighten that down. And then our neutral wire down to our neutral bar. And now with that done, we can slap on our plate, label all of our breakers, and then get to installing our DC side of our wiring connections. All right, so we made our DC connections on our inverter. Just like I said before, when I had the converter still off of the mount here, it's going to need a 5/32 Allen key to undo those little screws that are in place so that you can slide in your wiring for that. So the manual is also going to state the wire gauge that you're going to need depending on the length that you're running. We're running about maybe 5-6 feet here, so I went with 1 gauge wire. This is all going to change depending on your setup. So let's go ahead. We're going to attach our cable over onto our DC side of our battery. Okay, so now I have our positive and our negative cables running from our inverter over onto our battery. Those are all hooked up. I'm going to go ahead, and as you can see, I left a little bit extra wire here just in case. I'm going to strap that up so that that's not hanging down and taking any risk of getting damaged, and then we can go ahead and install our remote. All right, so the next part of our installation is going to be installing our remote. So this will allow you to control your inverter without having to actually go to your inverter, especially since we have our inverter installed outside in a cargo bay. So this is going to make it a little bit easier. Especially because we're going to be placing it in the bedroom, just because there was no real good location in the kitchen that I could easily run the wire down without having it be in the slide out. I don't want to take any chance at any moving parts damaging our cable, because then we got to rerun it all again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to route our cable through the same hole that I routed our wires for our AC in and our AC out, and we're just going to follow the frame over to our inverter. Alright, as you can see, we clearly had more than enough wire for what we were doing with our application here today, so we just zip tied it up. And then I'm going to install our remote right here on the side of our bed frame, because this is where kind of all of our electrical components are. So I'm going to just kind of draw out a little spot where I want it, and then I'm going to use my tool to drill out the hole, because this is going to be a flush mount remote. Let's get started on that. All right, now we can go ahead and secure our remote with 2 screws. All right, now we can go ahead and hook up our connector, With our remote now connected to our inverter, we can go ahead and test our inverter out and see if it works. Okay, so now that we're hooked up to our shore power and we have our breakers on, I'm going to go ahead. We can use this button right here. This will turn on our display. And then this button over here kind of rolls through our voltage. So right now you can see we're on the battery. It's reading 13.3 volts. If I hit this button again, it's going to tell me 115 volts because that's what we're hooked up to shore power wise. If you ever have any issues, maybe you have a fault somewhere, there is a little red fault button that's going to pop up right here. And then it'll also give you an error code. You can press this button to kind of scroll through, and it'll give you more information so that you can troubleshoot whatever issue you might be having. It's a little bit hard to get our camera in the cargo compartment here to show you it actually going into our inverter. So I've actually already ran our power wire that we're going to have running from our battery, and then also our negative up into the inverter using the little Allen key to connect to our posts on the inside that I showed you earlier in the installation. And then I've also run a wire for our ground. So in the instructions it requires 8 gauge wire. We're using a little bit heavier. We have some 4 gauge wire that I already had sitting here, so I'm just going to go ahead and use that. And then we're going to use a self-tapping screw and then just put it straight to the frame, which is right up on the other side of this box here. So I'm going to go ahead and shoot that in there. And then also we're going to be installing a fuse in line with our positive wire running from our inverter over to our battery. For that, I'm just using one of our Polock 100 amp circuit breakers. This can easily be reset, so if there's ever a trip or anything, this little piece will pop out, and just to reset it, all you have to do is just press that back up. This I'm going to also mount to our frame, make it super easy. Just connect our power wire here with some ring terminals. As you can see, I've already cut it. And then once that is done, we can go ahead and hook up our positive and our negative cables to our battery. All right, so you're going to have a battery line and an auxiliary load. So our load is going to be going to our inverter. Our battery is going to be going to our battery. So you just want to make sure that you're putting this exactly the best way for these wires to sync up with our posts. All right, now that we have all of our wiring in place and we're all done hooking up, we can go ahead and slide our plate back in and cover up our wiring terminals. Just gotta find our hole, get this started. Well, I think that about does it for our installation of the Progressive Dynamics Pure Sine Wave Inverter with transfer switch here on our 2007 Four Winds Chateau. My name's Kevin. Thanks for watching.